Okay, Assalamu alaikum. Good morning to everyone around the kingdom, and good evening to Dr. Chishti, and welcome to this webinar. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Yusuf Chisti, who accepted our invitation to present this seminar about microalgae for wastewater treatment opportunities and challenges. This seminar is organized by KFUPM Chemical Engineering Department and the Integrated Research Center for Membrane and Water Security. So first, a little bit, very brief introduction of our speaker today. If you Google Dr. Chishti name, you will find a lot of impressive stuff about him. So, but I will be very brief about his introductions, main highlights. Dr. Yusuf is a professor of biochemical engineering at School of Engineering in Massey University, New Zealand. He did his PhD in 1988 from University of Waterloo. And on his record, he has more than 300 publications, including several books. Among them, one of the highly cited is Airlift Bioreactors, that was published in 1989. When I was just a school-going kid, so he is so experienced person in this field. So his research publication has earned more than 42,000 citations, and that tells the quality of his scholarly work. And he is well known in the biochemical communities around the world, as he has spoken more than 200 international conferences, and I was honored to be a part of some of those where I have listened to Dr. Chishti. So beside his earned PhD, he is also awarded a honorary doctorate from the Hore Ashi Technical University of Lassi in Romania in recognition to his contribution to the chemical and biochemical engineering field. And in 2014, he is also awarded the University of Waterloo Engineering Alumni Achievement Medal in the Academic Excellence category. And he also sits on the editorial board of around 12 scientific journals of high quality. So even from this slide, you can imagine the work Dr. Chishti have done in this field and the recognition of this work at various forums. So as I mentioned, you can see the research, the quality of the research that is conducted by Dr. Chishti around achieving now soon 50,000 citations. And his area is biochemical engineering, bioprocess engineering, industrial biotechnology, fermentation technology, and algal biotechnology. So that is a very brief intro of my respected speaker today. So during the seminar, the participant can engage with the speaker related to the theme in a two ways. Either you can type your question in the chat, and I will ask the doctor at the end of the presentation, or otherwise you can raise your hand at the end of the presentation and you can ask the question directly to Dr. Yusuf Chisti. So that's from my side. So Dr. Yusuf, once again, warm welcome. Thank you so much. And now the webinar is over to you. You can start sharing your screen. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Farooq, and thank you for inviting me for this presentation. And I will start my presentation here. Okay, so the subject of my talk is about microalgae, how microalgae can be used for wastewater treatment, and the challenges and opportunities associated with the use of microalgae for wastewater management. The subjects that I'll be covering in this talk, first of all, I'll explain to you what exactly are microalgae. Also, I'll be referring to cyanobacteria. I'll not distinguish between these two. You could just think of them all as microalgae, although they are distinct. They're all photosynthetic microorganisms that are both used for certain wastewater treatment processes. Next, we'll see how can microalgae and cyanobacteria, how can we use them for wastewater treatment? Then we'll go on to see what exactly are the mechanisms. How does algae-based water treatment work? It works quite effectively in certain situations, and we'll see what mechanisms are involved in this process. Next, we'll go on to look at how do we separate, how do we recover the algal biomass after we have used the algae for water treatment, because one of the important purposes of algae-based treatment is simultaneously to produce algae biomass, which is of high value for certain applications. We'll see what applications the algae biomass that we produce as a consequence of wastewater treatment could be used, and we'll go on to then summarize and conclude. So the first issue, what exactly are microalgae and cyanobacteria? Let's look at that. So what are microalgae and cyanobacteria? You must have seen standing pools of water, or maybe lakes and rivers that look green, and the seawater, of course, looks greenish too. This green color is due to the presence of primitive photosynthetic plants, if you like. You could call them plants. They're microscopic. You cannot see them with your naked eye, but they are plant-like organisms. There are 45,000 different species of them that are around. You can grow them in seawater, marine, as well as freshwater, lakes and rivers, as well as brackish water containing a bit of salt. So you find them in all these habitats. What they would look like if you magnified them under a microscope, you could have species such as this. The order of size could be maybe 20 micrometers, alga called Senodismus, or you could have even less, a quarter of this. So quite a small organisms that can be different, many different kinds. So these are the microalgae that we're going to use to treat our wastewater. Now, I'd like to point out here that there is something else that's called macroalgae. What exactly this is and what I'm not going to talk about are these. These are macroalgae, large algae or seaweeds. These are large plants that are used in industrial processes, that are used as food, very delicious foods actually. But this is not what I'm going to talk about because it's not used in wastewater treatment. We are talking about microalgae, so that's distinct from macro or seaweeds. Okay, now just as you see here, you have a pond in which the algae are growing. For use for treating wastewater with algae, you'll need to have some kind of a pond system. And what that would typically look like is a system like this. So you have a pond which is quite shallow. A whole bunch of ponds are shown here. These ponds are very shallow, and they are laid out over a large area. That means they have a high surface area to volume ratio. We'll look at some of the specific numbers. The reason that they have to have a high surface area is that this treatment process is driven by sunlight. And sun absorption of sunlight depends on the surface area that's available to you. These ponds are known as raceway ponds because they're shaped like a racetrack, a horse racetrack, if you like. Or they are also known as high rate algal ponds, HRAP. High rate because the rate of oxidation of the organic matter in these ponds tends to be rather high. They're also known as Oswald ponds, after the inventor William J. Oswald. They were first invented in the 1960s. The pond could have a shape like this, as shown here, or it could have a somewhat different configuration, such as this. It's the same pond. You have a paddle wheel that rotates continuously. It drives the liquid wastewater to flow around. Here you have the same continuous loop, the paddle wheel driving the flow. These are baffles to direct the flow. Again, baffles to direct the flow and right around this channel and back to the start of the paddle wheel. Your wastewater, the feed, enters here somewhere in front of the paddle wheel, and after the entire loop is complete, your treated water is taken out here as the harvest. The thing is that the depth of these ponds is very small, only 25 to 30 centimeters, so quite shallow ponds. And the reason is that sunlight doesn't penetrate too deep in this green liquid, so there's no point having a deeper pond than 25 centimeter. They have a high surface to volume ratio, much higher than you'd find in conventional treatment processes, again, because you're trying to maximize the area to capture sunlight, which derives the photosynthesis carried out by the algae. And we'll see why we require that. A single pond, either this kind or this is also considered a single pond, would have a area of up to 2.5 hectares, which is quite large. But more commonly, the area is around 0.5 hectares. Now, this configuration shown here corresponds to something similar to this. So this is what an algae treatment pond looks like. Now, let's have a look at how some of these might appear in practice, and we'll see raceway ponds of this configuration, quite shallow, 20 to 25 centimeter deep. Each pond has a paddle wheel. This is a whole line of paddle wheels here. And so if I magnify this, the paddle wheel, and makes the fluid, the wastewater, circulate. The algae may have green color, or at some stages of their life, certain algae would acquire a different color, red color, for example. The paddle wheel runs continuously day and night, 24 hours operation. So, and the purpose, of course, is that you have to have sufficient velocity in this channel to keep the algae suspended. Algal cells must always be suspended, and also the suspension velocity must be such that the cells are brought to the surface from the deeper parts of the pool frequently, because the surface, that's where the light is captured. The maximum biomass concentration that you might attain in this pond at steady state would be of order of 0.5 kilogram per cubic meter, so 0.5 gram per liter. So very dilute, even though it looks so dark green, actually the culture is very dilute. You could have algae treatment ponds of a somewhat different configuration, such as this. These are circular ponds, still only about 30 centimeter deep, with this mechanical arm circulating to keep the algae in suspension, although this configuration is used far less compared to the raceway, because this is a more effective configuration compared to the circular one. You could have static pools of algae. Here, these are known as lagoons. This one is only 10 centimeter deep, but they are not used for wastewater treatment. These are used for growing certain algae to produce beta carotene. This color that you see, they are not used for wastewater treatment. Only this and this configuration would generally be used for water treatment. Let's now see how an algae-based water treatment facility might look like. Generally, the layout of the facility would be something like this. You have, prior to the algae pond, you have an anaerobic pond that I'll not go into. The anaerobic pond is quite deep, 4 to 5 meter deep, and it would have a residence time. The water entering, the water leaving, the residence time in the pond would be of order of 85 to 120 days. So quite a long residence time. The purpose of this pond is simply to sediment all the suspended material that must be removed prior to the wastewater entering the pond. So the wastewater that enters the algae pond, it's important to understand, needs to be clear, almost clear, because any suspended solids would interfere with penetration of sunlight into the liquid. So that's a limitation that we have to live with, that the water must be more or less clear before it enters the algae treatment pond. The loading that you can have, the BOD loading, BOD5, biochemical oxygen demand, a measure of organic carbon content in the water, can be of the order of 100 to 400 kilogram BOD per hectare of the area of the ponds per day. So the treatment can be quite heavy loading, and the residence time in this pond tends to be only 7 to 11 days, unlike the 85 days to 120 days in this anaerobic pond. So this is what we are concerned about. This is what we'll focus on. And once you have had a residence time of 7 to 11 days, the next component of the process is shown here. You have the algal slurry, algal suspension leaving. So this contains the treated wastewater plus the algae cells, green suspension. You somehow need to remove the algae. How you do that typically is you have a mixing tank in which you add a flocculant, usually aluminum sulfate. You mix the suspension with the flocculant quite rapidly, disperse the flocculant in the fluid, and then you go into a second tank where there is gentle mixing. It's important to have gentle mixing so that, and we'll explain how this process works for flocculation. Once the algae cells have been flocculated, they go into a settling vessel or a sedimentation tank where the algae flocks settle and the clear water is taken out there. Also, this algae slurry, it's a liquid. It's a concentrated slurry of algae, but quite liquidy. This goes to some filtration or centrifugation process in which more water is removed and we are left with algal paste. So the outcome is two valuable stream. Of course, you have the treated water, which is your primary objective, but you also have a lot of algal paste, which is important for this process because this is an important economic factor, an economic contribution of this process. Let's look at how exactly the process in this pond works. How is the biological waste degraded? So the treatment is actually carried out by a mixed culture, a consortium of algae and bacteria. People often forget to talk about bacteria, but bacteria are present in the pond, and these two interact together in order to achieve the treatment. So if we look at this algae pond, this is the wastewater going in, with the chemical oxygen demand, COD, organic matter, nitrogen, and phosphorus. This is our pond. It contains microalgae and bacteria. What actually happens is the organic matter, COD, is oxidized by bacteria using oxygen that is produced within this pond by photosynthesis by microalgae. So unlike conventional activated sludge process where you bubble a lot of oxygen and you don't provide any oxygen here, all the oxygen in the pond is generated in situ by microalgae. This oxygen is used by bacteria to oxidize cod to produce carbon dioxide. This carbon dioxide is used by algae. Photosynthesis requires carbon dioxide, nitrogen, phosphorus that the algae absorb. And of course, it requires sunlight to produce oxygen. So this is how the process works. Of course, this process, sunlight is there only during daytime. So oxygen production can occur only during daytime. So this operation, degradation using a combination of algae and bacteria, works only during sunlight. So algae use carbon dioxide to sunlight to produce oxygen by photosynthesis. Now, because the sun doesn't shine all the time, that means during the day, there's a lot of oxygen in the pond. But during night, there is no photosynthesis, no production of oxygen. That means that oxygen concentration in the pond varies with the diurnal cycle. During daytime, there's oxygen. During night, there is no oxygen. After the treatment, the algae have grown because through the photosynthesis, the algae cells are sedimented, algal biomass, and you have the clean water taken out, and algae biomass is your secondary product. Now, in this pond, during day and night, the pH changes. The pH changes because the concentration of dissolved carbon dioxide changes. During the day, carbon dioxide is consumed by the algae. So during peak sunlight, when you have a very high rate of consumption of carbon dioxide, the pond becomes alkaline, and we'll see that in a minute. During night, bacteria keep producing carbon dioxide, although they don't have oxygen. We'll see that drive oxygen from a different source, and the pond tends to become acidic. So of course, in such a large pond, you cannot control pH, and we don't control it, but there is a pH variation, and it's important to recognize this because it's used in has important implications. So if we plot the pH of the pond water against time, at sunrise, the pH is around 8. At solar noon, when there's a lot of sunlight, the photosynthesis is occurring rapidly. Carbon dioxide is being consumed. Carbon dioxide produced by bacteria is consumed by the algae. Concentration of carbon dioxide in the pond declines and the pH rises. It could rise to as high as 9 or even higher, 10. So this pH change occurs, and there are two mechanisms for it. One is, of course, your bicarbonate and H plus hydronium ion combined to give you carbonic acid that splits into carbon dioxide and water. Carbon dioxide is consumed by the algae, so that results in a net consumption of H plus and alkalinity increasing. And this, of course, this mechanism tends to dominate at pH around 8 or less than 8, early in the morning, late at night, late in the evening. There is a second mechanism that also operates in relation to pH, and that is your HCO3 bicarbonate being split into carbon dioxide and alkali. So this CO2 is consumed by the algae during daytime, and OH concentration increases, therefore the pH increases. This mechanism tends to dominate the higher pH values, not greater than 10. Both mechanisms operate, but which is dominant varies with the pH situation. And this effect is important for treatment, and we'll see how it helps with the treatment. Now let's look at the performance of the wastewater treatment with the algae system. Now let's look at domestic wastewater, domestic sewage. These are the typical characteristics of domestic wastewater. It has a chemical oxygen demand in this range. Domestic sewage also contains nitrogen around this range and a certain amount of phosphorus. The aim of the treatment, whenever you're treating the domestic sewage, your primary aim is to reduce chemical oxygen demand from around 600 to 900 to maybe 75 to 100 milligram per liter. At this point, this water is ready to be discharged to a natural environment. So the purpose of the treatment is to change primarily the cod level from this level to that level. Let us see how effective algal process is in achieving these aims. So algal treatment, it will remove cod from this level by 90%. That means if you remove 90% of the cod, you will come down to this level of chemical oxygen demand remaining. That means you're able to treat using algal pond wastewater in terms of your objective of reducing cod. That can be done, no problem. Then the algal process also removes nitrogen and phosphorus. How much is removed depends on the operating conditions. Now, operating conditions, we can't really control too much. Operating conditions, I mean the temperature. Temperature is what the temperature is out there. So in a warmer climate, removal rate would be different than in a colder climate. It depends on the sunlight level, because sunlight levels are different in different geographical regions. Also, whether you are at the equator or whether you are further away from the equator, sunlight level depends on that. Overall, though, in general, you'll be able to remove 80 to 90% of nitrogen that's present in the wastewater. So 80 to 90% of this could be removed. Of course, it's important to understand that around 45% of the nitrogen removal is not due to algae, but due to stripping of nitrogen from the surface of the pond. We'll see how exactly this mechanism works. So just remember that around 45% nitrogen is removed by stripping. I'll come back to this. And the other thing is the removal rate is of the order of 20 milligram nitrogen per liter per day. If you compare this to the conventional activated sludge process, you are able to remove nitrogen much faster in the activated sludge process if you have a nitrogen removal step installed. So removal by algae is comparatively slow compared to activated sludge. Nonetheless, you'll find that it's much cheaper because here you don't have to provide too much energy to provide oxygen to the system. Algae and sunlight cause oxygen supply in the pond for removal of cod and nitrogen and phosphorus. In terms of phosphorus, you're able to remove nearly 80% of this phosphorus. The removal rate is of that order. But in 7 to 11 days residence time in the pond, you're able to remove most of the nitrogen and phosphorus. Now, we said nitrogen removal is partly 45% is by stripping. What exactly, we'll look at this in a minute. Now, another important aspect of treatment is that you want to, from domestic sewage, you want to remove pathogenic bacteria, E. coli, for example, or coliform bacteria, we call them. How effective is the algae process in removing any coliform? These coliform, 99% of the coliform in the clarified sewage would be removed by algae process. The mechanism is in the pond during daytime, there's a high oxygen. High oxygen in combination with high sunlight level tends to create oxidizing radicals that damage these coliform bacteria. Also, during midday, your pH tends to be high, 9 to 10, and many coliforms are susceptible to pH. They'll be destroyed by alkaline pH. And these are the mechanisms that are responsible for removal of coliforms. Now let's see how nitrogen removal by stripping works. 55% of nitrogen is removed maybe by algae, but the rest is removed by stripping. What exactly is this? Of course, one thing to note is that your wastewater that you're using must be free of toxins and heavy metals. Because if you have toxins or heavy metals in the wastewater, then the algae biomass that you produce cannot be used. The only thing you could do with algae, this biomass, is use it as a landfill. So therefore, your water must be clean in terms of not having toxics and heavy metals, so that the algae that you produce can actually be put to some proper use. Okay, let's go on to see how nitrogen is removed by stripping. There are two mechanisms of nitrogen removal by stripping. One is in water, nitrogen, when it's in the form of ammonium, it's actually in equilibrium between ammonium form and ammonia, NH3. Depending on pH, say pH 9, 24 degrees Celsius of common operating conditions, 35% of the nitrogen will be unionized, so it'll be in this form. If the pH is higher, 10, nearly 84% of the total nitrogen would be in this form. So depending on pH, the higher, the more alkaline the pH, the more of the nitrogen will be in this form, and that will tend to volatilize or evaporate from the surface of the pond, if you like. So part of the nitrogen removal is due to this mechanism, although this mechanism is not very important. There is a second mechanism that is much more important, and that is denitrification. You see, during the day, the conditions in the pond are aerobic, highly oxygen rich. But during night, there's no production of oxygen. The conditions become anaerobic at night. And that's when the denitrification occurs. Most of the nitrate present at the end of the day is in the form of nitrate. This nitrate contains oxygen. Bacteria extract this oxygen, converting nitrate to nitrite, and extract this oxygen, converting nitrite to nitrogen. This nitrogen leaves this through the surface of the pond. So bacteria, because in the night they don't have access to oxygen, they use oxygen in nitrate and nitrite to oxidize the organic matter. And this is how nearly 45% of nitrogen is removed from the water. Now, in the lab, of course, we can't do, in the field, we can't do many experiments because they are very difficult to do. So we do a lot of experimental work on algal ponds in the lab. In our labs, the ponds look like this. So this is a raceway pond. It's also 30 centimeter deep, just as a full-scale raceway pond. It has a paddle wheel the same size as in a typical raceway pond, same size in diameter. You have the wastewater here that has been formulated, so we can formulate any composition of wastewater. We can control the residence time by controlling the feed flow rate and the overflow rate, maintaining the depth in the pond constant. We can control the sunlight level by using these artificial lights that simulate sunlight. So we can go from sunrise in the morning, increase light intensity, all by clockwork. We can simulate sunlight levels corresponding to summer, corresponding to winter, as well as different geographic locations on the surface of the earth. So what we can do is under different conditions, we can measure the degradation rate, including at different temperatures. You know, the pond may be located in a cold climate or a warm climate, and we can model the removal process as a function of temperature and sunlight. And we can use this data to attempt to predict the performance of the large scale ponds in the field. Of course, this wastewater will have to inoculate with some algae to start the process, and we grow the algae in small culture bottles, and this becomes our seed, and that's added to the water to provide the algae. Now let's compare algal treatment with conventional activated wastewater treatment process. The conventional process you're of course quite familiar with. It's well established. That's how municipal wastewater is treated all over the world by activated sludge process. Algae process, the water needs to be free of suspended solids, as I explained to you, because they interfere with penetration of light in the algal pond. The thing with the activated sludge process, and that's the disadvantage of it, is that's very energy intensive. It requires a lot of energy to provide aeration and mixing. Now, 50% of the total cost of treatment of water by activated sludge process is actually the cost of energy, providing aeration and oxygen. In the algae process, the sunlight and the algae that provide the oxygen. So this cost is minimized. Activated sludge, most of the nitrogen, phosphorus remains in the effluent unless you use tertiary treatment. Now here, our energy cost is much lower, 50% of the cost here, and that's the main advantage of reducing the cost of treatment. The other thing, of course, the wastewater must contain, for an algae operation, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus in a certain ratio, which generally is what happens. So if the wastewater is short of carbon, you'll need to provide carbon dioxide. Generally, we don't need to do that, but this is something to keep in mind. If you don't have sufficient carbon, your nitrogen and phosphorus will not be removed completely because there is not sufficient carbon to grow the algae biomass. Then we have seen that some of the nitrogen is removed by volatilization, and some goes and is captured by the algae biomass, and some phosphorus is captured by the algae biomass. If you have too much nitrogen, you cannot remove it unless you also provide phosphorus, because there has to be a certain ratio of nitrogen phosphorus, and that's the ratio that you get in the algae biomass. The other thing to remember is that ammonium concentration in algae treatment process cannot exceed 100 milligram per liter, because ammonium is toxic to algae. If you have concentrations greater than this, you will need to dilute your wastewater in order to treat it with the algal process. So these are some limitations. Another important consideration is for the activated sludge conventional process, a facility that's around 1 hectare in area is sufficient to treat effluent from a fairly decent sized town, 40,000 people population, if you like. Now, if you were to treat effluent from the same number of people using algae process, you'll require 30 hectares, which is completely unrealistic. So that means that algae process applicable only to small towns, if you like, maybe 6,000 persons would be the limit. It's applicable to individual facilities. As you have an individual dairy farm, maybe 500 to 1,000 cows, you could treat the effluent from this process using an algae treatment process. You could treat the effluent from individual food processing factories, etc. So there's a limitation to size. Here, the residence time is very short. Activated sludge process, 0.3 days. In algal treatment, you require a longer residence time. And the outcomes, of course, are different. You have treated wastewater in both cases. Here you have a lot of nitrogen phosphorus that's remaining unless you use tertiary treatment. Here, most of the nitrogen phosphorus would be removed by the algal biomass. In addition to the treated wastewater, your product is algal biomass, and this is an important product. Here, the product is activated sludge that you can only use more or less to produce methane, if you like, which is a low-value product by anaerobic digestion. So while these are the comparison differences, once you have grown the algae, you must separate the green cells from the water, and that's typically done by a flocculation, which is by a two-three step process. In the first step, you then take the algal broth coming out your raceway pond, you add the flocculant, mix it rapidly, then continue mixing, but gently. It's important to see the differentiation. Gentle mixing allows the algae flocks to contact with each other, but the mixing is not so intense to break the flocks apart. So this gentle mixing is important to increase flock size. Once you have done that for a certain amount of time, 32 minutes in this case, you let the process, you stop mixing completely, and you let the algae flocks settle, and they'll settle like this in about 30 minutes. So you've gone from there to there. Here, they will never settle. They will just stay like that. The point is that this slurry has a lot of water, quite a lot of water, and will require further treatment to remove this water, and we'll see that. How these processes are carried out together, often maybe in a system like this, your algae raceway pond will provide a broth with 0.5 gram per liter algae, or 0.5 kilogram per cubic meter. You'll mix it with the flocculant. You'll pass it through a sedimentation tank, recover this sedimented solids, and that's one of your product, your clarified water, your treated water is your other product. Sedimentation can recover nearly all the biomass, but it still has a lot of water in it and needs to be further treated. And this process can, of course, be done all in a single unit, if you like, as here you have the algal slurry coming in, mixed with your flocculant. Within the pipe, there is rapid mixing for a certain amount of time. The pipe enters. This is the sedimentation zone. This mixer appears to be operating it operates very gently, okay? Here you have certain mixing in the upper zone, but you have almost no mixing down here because the tip speed, tip velocity here is much faster than the tip velocity of the agitator down here. So you have the sedimented algal slurry here, clarified water, all mixing with the flocculant sedimentation, all 3 steps done in a single process. So you've gone from this to this. You need to take this, you need to separate the water, you need to take this and treat it further to recover the biomass, either by filtration, because biomass is an important product of the whole process. And if you're not intending to produce the biomass, there is no point for the algal treatment in the first place. You could use filtration, a belt filter, a Dacron cloth, gravity suction filtration, or you could use centrifugation, large industrial centrifuges, not a very high G, just 3000 G force, and you'll get a paste like that. Now, algae, of course, are used in many applications. You could use them to fertilize your fields, to provide nitrogen, phosphorus rich fertilizers. They're used in certain animal feeds. The biomass may be too expensive to feed to large animals, but a small amount of biomass is used in fish feed and poultry feed because of the characteristic that biomass in relation to the color of the chicken eggs, for example, and the color of the fish flesh. So using animal feeds, using human food, to some extent, we'll see if you can produce it cleanly without any contamination. You can use algae to extract things like polyunsaturated fatty acids that are important in human health, in development of brain. Brain is all certain kind of fats that you need to have in your diet. You can use algal biomass to produce beta carotene. This is the orange color in carrots, commercially produced by certain algae. You can use algae to produce astaxanthin. Astaxanthin is this red color you find in salmon and lobsters and crabs. So when you grow these things, you need to feed them this color for them to develop this color. You have other applications of algae that I'll not go through. Now let's just look at human food application. There's a certain cyanobacterium called Arthrospira, commonly called spirulina. It looks like this here, and it's grown and has been grown for thousands of years naturally in West Africa here, as well as other regions around Lake Chad and in Nigeria and Chad and this region of West Africa. So people harvest it from the lake water. They put it through these porous baskets to concentrate the biomass. Then they'll place it on this cleared sand. Once they place the algae slurry here, the water soaks into the sand and the algae is left on top of the sand. So that's what they're doing. The water would soak in and you'll have a layer of algae. It'll be allowed to dry for just a few minutes. It's still a wet cake, and you can cut it off and peel it off the surface and then dry it further, and it's sold in the market and it's used as food. Nearly 250 tons is produced in this region alone, and of course, so that's 10% of global production. You have 90% being produced other places. You have this commercial production in the United States, China, various other places of this cyanobacterium for human consumption. Of course, you can use algae in certain aquaculture. Aquaculture is production of seafood by farming. Nearly 50% of the seafood is produced by aquaculture. So it's produced by farming, not by being caught in the sea. There's not enough supply in the sea for wild catch. And the seafood I'm talking about are these shrimps and these lobsters and these shellfish, salmon, all this 70% of the salmon is actually produced by aquaculture. Production of this kind of seafood requires algae. It's because these animals need to be fed. And algae tends to be an important component of their feed at certain stage of the life cycle. So you grow the algae, we call this green water. You may take this shellfish, larval shellfish, that shellfish spat, add them to the water. They'll filter the water, pump the water through the bodies to take out the algae, leaving clean water, and the algae they'll use for food. They'll grow to a certain size, and then they'll be planted in the sea because it's not too cost effective to keep feeding them the algae. They are planted in the sea to use natural algae to feed. You could, these shrimps, certain early stages of the shrimps require algae feed, although later stages the shrimp is carnivorous. Certain fish, these fingerlings that we call larval fish, some of them would need to be fed in algae biomass. And some fish, of course, eat live prey. So they eat these very tiny shrimps that are first fed on algae. The shrimps are then grown, then fed to the fish. And then, of course, this is what we get from our aquaculture farms. And finally, you have many, many other applications of algae in food and cosmetics. You have, all these colors, chlorophyll, phycoerythrin, astaxanthin, they're all produced by algae. They are used to color various foods, ice creams, and so on. You get these bottles of chlorella, this red algae. This is actually a macroalgae. Nonetheless, they're used as source of nutraceuticals. They're used as human nutrients. You get them in tablets, you get them in powder, you can spray them on your cornflakes, various ways. You have algae biomass being added to chocolates and so on to provide extra nutrients. You have astaxanthin, this thing added to creams to, this is a powerful antioxidant to provide you with various cosmetics and so on. So these are some of the applications of algae. And what I have here, I'll not show you this. It's a YouTube movie that you can watch in your own time just to have some perspective as to how algal wastewater treatment is done. At this point, I'll summarize because I'm nearly run out of time. And so what I have done is I have tried to explain to you how microalgae are used for treating wastewater. I've attempted to explain mechanism of treatment, how algae bacteria interact in a symbiotic relationship to treat the wastewater. And we've seen some advantages and limitations of algal treatment compared to the conventional activated sludge treatment. And we have seen how algal biomass is recovered at the end of the process and how the algal biomass may be used in certain applications. So this then concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Yusuf Chisti, for this impressive talk concluding the microalgae biotechnology, mainly focusing on wastewater and then the potential applications. So we have almost 50 participants, very good participation early in the morning in here. So now the floor is open for the question. Either you can chat, you can put your question in the QA or chat, or you can raise your hand. So I will give you the access for this. Just there is a one question. And oh.
So how do I get to the question?
Doctor, I will unmute the person.
Okay.
And he will ask the question. Yes, go ahead. Morita, please go ahead.
Yes, okay, yeah. So, hi, I'm Moritz from the Center for Environment and Marine Studies. So, yeah, first of all, thank you very much for the great, excellent presentation. And my question is regarding the treatment of more like industrial waste by the algal treatment. So you were saying in your presentation that the treatment as you presented it is mainly for domestic waste without any heavy metals or other toxic compounds. So I'm wondering if your algae treatment can be combined with a prior chemical treatment to remove trace metal and other toxic compounds. You showed that like prior to the algae treatment, you have this huge settlement tank to remove the suspended solids in the water. So maybe this tank could be used for chemical treatment beforehand.
Well, certainly you can combine it with chemical treatments. You can actually use the algae to absorb heavy metals from the water. But the problem is that if your water is contaminated with any kind of toxins, the algae you produce cannot be used for human food. They cannot be used for animal feed. So they lose their value. And producing valuable algae is part of the process economics of this treatment process. You know, you can use it for industrial waste, for example, farm waste, dairy farm waste. The farm waste is all organic material. There would be no heavy metals there if you have taken care that you're not adding any heavy metals in the farm feed or any such thing. So you can use it for the waste from food processing factories. But again, you'll have to take care that your water is not contaminated with chemicals that could be toxic, because you can treat toxic chemical containing waste, but the algae can then be used only for landfill mainly, because any contamination of the algal biomass with heavy metals or with any toxic material, no matter how small, will not let them to be used legally. You can't use it for human food. You can't use it for animal feed because the animals are then later eaten by humans. You can't use it for aquaculture. So the biomass then can only be used as landfill, which is a zero value proposition. So that is why we prefer to use it for, you can use it for industrial waste, but industrial wastewater that is clean, say food processing industries or farming sector, but not from heavy metals containing chemical processing plants.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Moses, for the questions. And of course, if you have a further question, you can approach Doctor by email now. I will move to the second questions. And at the end, I will take those questions that are in Q&A. So now, Mohammed Ibrahim. So please go ahead and ask the question.
Assalamu alaikum. Thanks for the excellent presentation, Dr. Yusuf. Just a question regarding the effect of the climate. Like now we are using the biomass for treatment for the waste, mostly domestic, as we said, but like I don't think that we can use this or implement this technology in every place. Maybe it's difficult to apply in Scandinavia or US, like colder climates. And the second part of it is the effect of climate change on the long term. Some areas are getting more severe weather conditions. So do such conditions impact the efficiency of technology for treatment?
Well, you know, actually you can, depending on the, you know, you have sun everywhere, first of all, but of course you don't have a warm temperature everywhere. But in places like Spain, south of France, pond treatment is used quite a lot. In the United States and California and Florida, there's quite a substantial pond-based treatment. In China. So there are many locations that it could be used quite easily. Of course, you can't use it where the temperature is frozen all the time because it's just not feasible. So yes, there is a climatic issue. Depending on the sunlight level and temperature, the pond treatment rates would be different, and those differences would need to be accommodated in the design to ensure that the treatment is effective. So the same pond area would not be equally effective in removing the waste in different geographical locations, because the sunlight level would be different, the temperature would be different. Now, you cannot use it in those locations, for example, where there's a heavy rainfall all the time. Although in my presentation, the YouTube link that's given there, you'll find that you can place these ponds under plastic liners, so that the sunlight can still get through, but you prevent dust and you prevent rain from getting into the pond. You can also place them under glass greenhouses type of installations, but you do need sunlight to be able to get through. So that's important.
Okay, thanks, Mohammed, and for asking the question, and thanks, Doctor, for replying. So the next, Nadeem Beg, Doctor, can you please go ahead and ask the question?
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Chisti, for the nice presentation and elaborating about the opportunities and challenges using the microalgae in the treatment of the wastewater treatment. Actually, I have a question regarding this. Like you have elaborated that, it is tough to use for the heavy metals and this microalgae. So like here, which kind of actually organics that we can target, or which class of compounds it is more useful to degrade them?
Well, for example, food waste, all the organic compounds, carbohydrates, proteins that you'd find in food waste, you can be easily degraded using algae. All the organic compounds that you'll find in typical non-toxic domestic wastewater could be degraded by algae. Remember that the carbon compounds are not actually being degraded by algae, they are degraded by bacteria. Algae are simply providing the oxygen to the bacteria for the degradation. Now, you could actually remove heavy metals using algae. You can do that. But what I'm saying, all the heavy metals cannot be degraded. All the heavy metals simply attach to the algae biomass. So if it's cadmium, zinc, any other, it'll remain lead, it'll remain as heavy metal. It would simply attach to the algae biomass and could then be filtered out of the wastewater. So the wastewater has been cleaned of the heavy metal. But now you're left with this algae biomass that the only application is landfill. You cannot use it in any other way because heavy metals are toxic. They cannot go into any kind of food chain. Every other organic material that that's non-toxic and can be degraded by bacteria as an activated sludge process could be degraded using the algae-based process, because the organic degradation is actually by bacteria, not by algae. Algae simply use sunlight and carbon dioxide to generate oxygen that you would otherwise need to provide to bacteria as you do in the activated sludge process at a very high cost. You have to bubble compressed air through the bacterial tank.
Thank you, Doctor. Very comprehensive answers to it. And next is Dr. Hassan Bakir, our chemical engineering chairman. He is also here to ask the doctor something. Doctor, you are allowed. Yes, please go ahead. Dr. Hassan, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you, Dr. Yusuf Chisti, for a really informative presentation. I really enjoyed it. I hope we can share the presentation with the attendees and they can watch the YouTube video after the presentation. I work in desalination, and one of the really interesting outcome of some research is you find some valuable byproducts. So in desalination, the metals and minerals that could be extracted sometime from desalinated water could be more valuable than the intended objective of the process. So I wonder, how would we be able to focus on the biomass that we produce and make it a scalable process integrated with other chemical processes and industries? Here at the Kingdom, we are heavily involved in chemical production, and maybe there could be some kind of an integration between bio-produced chemicals and the traditional chemical industry. What's your take on that?
I think it's actually possible. Now, if you're telling me that the metals that you have in the desalination process, they have a high potential value, then yes, you can use an algae-based process. You know, how I see this happening is you'd grow the algae biomass in a large operation treating non-toxic biological waste. Then you harvest this algae biomass and you add to your desalination process, where all the heavy metals, ionic forms of heavy metals, could be adsorbed to the biomass. And you filter out the biomass, so you are removing all the heavy metals, ionic forms of heavy metals adsorbed to the algae biomass out of the water. Now you can actually burn this algae biomass in a reducing atmosphere to convert your metal ion to base metal. So this way you could maybe recover the metal, but you know, here the metal has a value. If it has a high value, then that is fine. Your process economics could work out. This will need to be, of course, evaluated. Technically, it's possible. Technically, algae will adsorb, because the surface of algae cell carries a negative charge. All metal ions are positively charged. They all easily adsorb onto the surface of algae biomass. But then this biomass, then you have to recover the metal from the biomass, which you can do by burning, because biomass will all burn to carbon dioxide and some inorganic material. But in that process, we'll also convert the metallic ion. It'll reduce the ions in a reducing conditions to base metal. And if the metal has value, then the process potentially could pay for itself. So, I mean, those are things to evaluate and think about, but I see that possibility.
Thank you, Dr. Hassan, and thank you, Doctor. So, Doctor, just two more questions. I knew it's almost your dinner time. You're speaking for 1 hour, so just allow me to take two more questions. So, so Premlal, you are now you can ask the question to Doctor directly.
Good morning, Doctor. Thanks for the interesting presentation. I would like to know, can you share some light on the use of bioflux in aquaculture? Are they using some algae, or is it by some chemical methods?
Well, I mean, generally for feeding to aquaculture, we don't go through the flocculation process. What we do is we grow the algae, and the resulting suspension is used directly to feed the algae to aquaculture animals, to very small fish, very small shrimp, or to shellfish. You know what the shellfish do is they'll pump the water through their bodies, and they will filter the algae cells from the water, so the water will become clear, and the algae cells will be retained in the shellfish body, where they'll digest it to get the nutrients. We don't need to go through flocculation stage in order to feed aquaculture animals.
Oh, thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. There are two questions, and one of them is asked by Mutawakkil, and you answered this question already. The question is there any possibility of metal recovery? And you answered this question, I guess, twice. And the other question that is asking by anonymous attendee, the question is the raceway pound is a steady state and continuous process or a batch process? That's the last question, Doctor.
Well, I mean, it's not a steady state process. It's a continuous process, but it's a, I would say, pseudo steady state process. You see, the sunlight, sun doesn't shine steadily. So, but there's a cyclic variation. So you could think of it as algae ponds will achieve a pseudo steady state, not a proper steady state. That cannot happen because the sunlight is not steady. Okay, but it's a continuous process. Generally, what we do is we'll feed the pond in the day, slow down the feeding at night, or stop the feeding at night. So it's not a batch process. The process repeats on a daily basis. The flow is cyclic, if you like.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Doctor. So nice of you for your very interesting presentation. And even it's so interesting that even a person who is not working in algal biotechnology, it was crystal clear to understand. So nice of you. I'm really thankful for your time at this time on your side. It's 8 p.m. now, I guess.
Yeah, okay, well, no problem. All of you have a good day in Dammam and wherever you are. And so I'll just log off now, I guess. Thank you very much for joining. Yeah, bye.
Bye.